If a major war started tomorrow, most people wouldn't call their family. They wouldn't check on their neighbors. They wouldn't even look outside the window. They'd open their brokerage app, half awake, phone glowing in a dark room, red charts flickering on the screen like a hospital heart monitor flatlining. And within minutes, millions of people would do the same stupid thing. They would sell. Not because they understand markets, not because they've studied history, but because fear feels like intelligence when the world looks chaotic. So they sit there refreshing their portfolio, watching red candles fall like dominoes, convincing themselves they're being responsible by hitting the sell button. Meanwhile, the financial media is running at full power. Red banners, breaking news music, dramatic headlines screaming global markets in freefall because the market dropped 2%, which on most Tuesdays wouldn't even be worth mentioning. And while you're glued to the screen, heart racing, refreshing your account every 30 seconds, something strange is happening behind the scenes. Because while millions of investors panic sell their crypto, stocks, or index funds, someone else is quietly doing the exact opposite. They're buying, not randomly, not emotionally, but in a very specific order, based on what has happened to money during every major war of the last 100 years. And if you don't understand that pattern, the next crisis won't just scare you, it will cost you a fortune. So let me introduce you to two people, Babatunde and Mariam. Same morning, same breaking news alerts, same market panic splashed across every screen like red paint thrown at a wall. Babatunde is sitting on about £40,000 in index funds. Nothing fancy, just the boring long-term portfolio everyone says they're committed to until the world starts shaking. The moment the headlines hit, Babatunde does what millions of investors do when fear walks into the room. He opens the app. The chart is red. The news anchors are speaking faster. The word crisis is bouncing around the room like a fire alarm. So Babatunde convinces himself he's being smart. He sells. Because in that moment, panic feels like clarity. It feels like you finally figured it out, while everyone else is still asleep. Now meet Mariam, same portfolio, same 40,000, same headlines screaming from her phone like sirens on an empty street. But instead of staring at the chart like it's a burning building, Mariam reads one piece of data, just one. Since World War II, the S&P 500 has recovered from every major conflict in an average of 47 trading days. So she closes the app, turns off the news, and goes to work. Everything that happens next in this story is the difference between panic and a plan. Here's the statistic that completely destroys Babatunde's strategy. JP Morgan tracked what would happen if someone invested $10,000 into the S&P 500 and simply left it alone. From 2005 to 2024, that money grew to roughly $71,000. But now watch what happens when panic enters the room. Miss just the 10 best days in the market during that entire 20-year stretch. And the final result drops to around 32,000. Miss the 30 best days. And you basically spent 20 years running on a treadmill that never moved. Here's the twist most investors never see coming. Those best days almost always happen right next to the worst ones. 7 of the 10 biggest market surges in modern history happened within 2 weeks of the worst crashes. The drop and the recovery are basically the same storm, lightning, then thunder. But Babatunde ran for cover the moment the lightning struck, so when the rebound arrived, he wasn't standing in the field anymore. He was sitting in cash, watching the market climb like a rocket leaving the launch pad. Without him, And this is where Mariam's plan starts to look completely insane to the average investor. Because while Babatunde was hiding in cash, Mariam started buying. Here's the dangerous part. When Babatunde sold his portfolio, it didn't feel like fear. It felt like intelligence, like he had finally seen through the noise. The news looked bad, the charts were red, experts were shaking their heads on television like doctors delivering bad news in a hospital hallway. So Babatunde hit the sell button and felt something strange, relief. The same kind of relief people feel when they jump out of a burning building, even if they land on the pavement. Because doing something always feels better than doing nothing. But here's the trap. The market doesn't move like a slow train. It moves like a snapped rubber band. Violent drop, violent rebound, sometimes within hours. The morning Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. The S&P 500 fell more than 2% before the market even finished its coffee. By the end of the same day, it closed higher. Babatunde missed the rebound because once you've sold, your brain starts inventing new reasons not to get back in. Let things settle. Wait for clarity. Give it a few weeks. But markets don't reward clarity. They reward people who move while everything still looks messy. And while Babatunde sat in cash, waiting for the smoke to clear, Mariam was quietly doing something else. Now, this is the part that makes most investors uncomfortable. Because Mariam wasn't guessing. She wasn't scrolling Twitter looking for the next hot take. She wasn't staring at red charts like they were storm clouds rolling over the city. She was following a structure, a very boring, very deliberate order of assets based on what actually happens to money during wars. And the first step isn't stocks, it's the floor. Before Mariam bought a single investment, she built a cash buffer, 6 to 12 months of living expenses, sitting in a high-yield savings account, boring as a brick. Because if your financial house is built on sand, every market drop feels like an earthquake. But when your expenses are covered for months, volatility becomes background noise, like rain tapping on the roof while you sit inside. She also kept a small amount of physical cash, £2,000 to £5,000, not because the world is ending, but because modern wars don't start with bombs, they start with keyboards. Cyber attacks, banking disruptions, payment networks flickering off like lights in a power outage. A few weeks of physical cash isn't paranoia, it's insurance. But here's the important part. This is where most people make a second mistake. They stop here. They sit on cash while inflation quietly eats their money like termites inside a wooden house. Mariam didn't stop, because once the floor is built, the real strategy begins. Once the floor is built, Mariam moves to the next layer. Gold. Now, most people get gold completely backwards. They rush to buy it after the panic starts, like people sprinting to the supermarket when the shelves are already empty. But gold doesn't reward panic buyers. It rewards preparation. During almost every crisis in modern history, gold spikes when fear explodes across the headlines, then slowly gives back that fear premium once the worst-case scenario doesn't happen. Think of it like insurance. You don't buy fire insurance while your house is already burning. You buy it while everything still looks calm. But something different has been happening recently. While retail investors argue about crypto, central banks have been quietly buying gold, like farmers storing grain before winter. Thousands of tons, the highest levels of central bank buying in modern history. Then comes the part that makes people uncomfortable. Defense. Because wars don't just destroy things, they create the largest government spending programs the world has ever seen. Weapons, satellites, radar systems, missiles, supply chains moving like giant industrial conveyor belts. When governments go to war, defense companies become factories printing revenue. And while Babatunde was hiding in cash, those companies were quietly climbing. After defense, Mariam moves to the next layer: energy. Because wars don't just move armies, they move oil. Tankers crossing oceans, pipelines becoming geopolitical chess pieces, entire economies running on barrels of crude moving through narrow shipping lanes like blood through arteries. And when those arteries tighten, prices spike. We saw it in 2022 when oil exploded above $100 a barrel. Energy companies didn't just survive that chaos, they printed money. Then comes the most boring part of the strategy: consumer staples. Because during wars, people cancel holidays. They postpone buying new cars. They stop going to fancy restaurants. But they do not stop buying toothpaste, coffee, soap, paper towels. The companies selling those products behave like the financial equivalent of a heavy anchor. They don't shoot up like rockets, but they don't sink when the storm arrives either. And finally, inflation protection, because wars are expensive. Governments borrow massive amounts of money. Debt expands. Currencies slowly lose purchasing power like air leaking out of a tire. So Mariam adds assets designed to rise with inflation, while Babatunde sits in cash, watching the value of his money quietly shrink. Now here's the rule Mariam never breaks. She never sells her index funds. Not during wars, not during crashes, not when the headlines start screaming like sirens in the middle of the night. Because something strange happens during wars that most people never think about. Governments spend a lot. Weapons, fuel, logistics, technology. Entire industries turning into giant machines pumping money into the economy like a fire hose. And that money flows into businesses, which flows into earnings, which flows into the stock market. So while Babatunde was sitting in cash, waiting for the world to feel safe again, the market was already moving, like a train leaving the station while he was still standing on the platform. 4 years later, Babatunde's £40,000 had crawled to roughly 48,000. Mariam's portfolio, around 91,000. Same starting point, same headlines. Two completely different outcomes. Because Babatunde bought the panic. Mariam bought the assets. And the next time the world feels like it's falling apart, one of those investors will be building wealth. The other will be funding the system that profits from fear. You decide which investor you're gonna be.